오케이. 잘 들립니까? 이거 스피커 뭐가 중복됐다. I would like to ask excuse to foreign fellows because the English limitation. I will proceed my lecture by Korean language, but there's many English terminologies, so probably you can understand. And at the important point, I will speak, or Dr. Huang translate. Okay.
Right. I'll try my best, sir.
오늘 준비한 내용은 여러분들이 좀 흥미를 가질 수 있는 케이오스하고 피블레이션에 대한 얘기인데 지난번에 이제 시술하다가 조 선생한테 케이오스하고 랜덤의 차이가 뭐냐 그러니까 너무 정확하게 답을 얘기를 해가지고 모티베이션이 돼서 준비를 했습니다. 자, 피블레이션 그러면 우리가 보통 이제 랜덤 아주 디스오거나이즈 리듬으로 생각하기 쉬운데 랜덤하고 케이오스는 좀 다르거든요. 그래서 그 non-linear dynamics에서 어떻게 설명하나 한번 보도록 하겠습니다.
듣고야 되겠다, 좀.
이 왼쪽에 있는 그림은 황선 선생님께서 주신 사진입니다. 아주 아름답죠? 이 밀키웨이인데 이 아르치스 캐니언에서 찍으신 사진이고 우리가 이거 이제 코스모스라고 보통 얘기하는데 얘가 어떻게 하면은 케이오스로 바뀌는 순간이 되면은 이렇게 피블레이션 같은 페어릭한 리듬 또는 우주에도 케이오스가 있죠. 또 우리 버터플라이 이펙트 그러면은 if the butterfly flies to Beijing, there's the tornado in America. So you can 그래서 그걸 이제 케이오스 티어리를 설명을 하고 있고 이 케이오스 티어리의 그 아버지라고 하시는 분은 로렌스라는 분입니다. 뒤에 나올 텐데 이분이 만든 로렌스 어트랙터 이 수식 방정식으로 케이오스를 설명을 했는데 이 사람이 만든 방정식을 보면은 이런 나비 모양이에요. 그래서 버터플라이 하이포테시스가 나온 이유가 it is because the Lorentz attractor shape is similar to butterfly. Okay, and there, if we reflect this chaos theory to the electrophysiology, we see the spiral wave is a source of fibrillation. 자, 이거는 Holt recording. The patient was died during sleep with Holter, cosmos rhythm, sinus rhythm, all of a sudden change to ventricular fibrillation, slow down, and eventually sinus arrest, asystole. However, even during ventricular fibrillation, it's the same animal model. Rhythm keep changing as global ischemia progress, as we saw in the previous MAD case. 그래서 글로벌 이스케미아에 보면은 이런 아주 디스오거나이즈 피블레이션이 오거나이즈 됐다가 엔드 스테이지 가면 다시 슬로우 ventricular fibrillation 다시 바뀌게 됩니다. 자, 그러면은 이런 그 사이너스 리듬이 이같이 fibrillation 바뀌는 order to disorder 또는 cosmos to chaos라고 할 수가 있겠는데 여기 이제 mathematical model하고 physicist들이 만든 모델들이 여러 개 있는데 여기 보시면 이런 리듬이 케어릭하게 디스오거나이즈 되면 될수록 하나의 periodicit를 갖는다는 거예요. 그래서 이거를 이제 quasi periodicit라고 얘기하는데 거기에 대한 모델이 있고 이게 어느 정도 더 진행을 하게 되면 마치 여기서 이제 이 스모크가 오거나이즈하게 가다가 어떤 임계점에 달하게 되면은 갑자기 터뷸런스로 완전히 디스오거나이즈로 바뀌는 그 순간이 있거든요. 마치 스타게이트에 들어가듯이 그 부분을 이제 케이오스로 들어가는 걸 설명을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 쿼지 피리오디스트를 잠깐 설명을 하면은 이건 atrial fibrillation RR interval 리듬입니다. 이거는 사이너스 리듬. x-axis this deployed RR interval, y-axis is next beat RR interval, a sinus rhythm. But during atrial fibrillation, we call it the typical ECG finding is irregular RR interval, right? But if you plotting the Poincaré plot, there's some pattern. So this is so-called 안 들려요?
아니, 잘 들려.
Yeah, quasi-periodicity. So in the initial the fibrillation period, there is a relatively organized, but there is disorganized, and this pattern changes to like this. And this periodicity is always 이해ен성. 이해ен성은 영어로 뭐라 그러니? 설명을 좀. Two power
Yes.
of n. Okay. So even though it is long periodicity, it is like the fibrillation rhythm can have some periodicity. That's why we don't call the fibrillation is random. It is chaos. Okay. 자, 왜 quasi periodicity라고 그러냐? 이게 뭐죠? 노틀다름 껍질. 주인공 이름이 quasimodo죠. quasi means 덜 떨어졌다. 응? Even though it has a periodicity, it is not the perfect periodicity. That's why we call it quasi-periodicity. And the quasi-periodicity is explained by fractal model. This is Dr. Gratefully Dr. Chonang provided. He spent the whole day in the Sagrada Familia. 가우디가 만든 사그라타 파밀리아에서 이거 찍었는데 이 기둥을 잘 보세요. If you look at the pillar structure carefully, it's like a branch, 3 branches. I don't know how he imagined this kind of fractal model. At that time, the chaos theory is developing stage. And if you look at the Purkinje distribution, it's also a fractal model. And this is a ventricular fibrillation, the digital twin modeling. They also branch like this. This is so-called fractal model. And let's see the mathematical analysis of quasi-periodicity, chaos, and fractal model. This is 2 times of periodicity, right? So this axis time, y-axis is complexity. Complexity slowly growing, and all of a sudden point change to 이해en성. 그러다가 더 복잡해지죠? complex, 2, 4, 8, 16, 64. In this 2의 파워로 계속 이렇게 프랙탈 모델로 이렇게 굉장히 복잡해 보이지만은 여기 보면은 전부 다 2의 N승으로 계속 periodicity가 늘어나는 걸 볼 수가 있어요. 그래서 이거를 만데브라우라는 수학자가 이 모델을 만들었는데 여기 보면 이게 그 이쁜 그림 같지만은 세밀하게 보면 이게 전부 다 프랙탈 모델입니다. 근데 이게 어느 certain 포인트에 가면은 조금 아까 봤던 이 프랙탈 모델이 Z축으로 해서 이렇게 돈다고 생각을 해보세요. 그러면 평면이 돼버리겠죠. 그러면서 이게 케이오스로 넘어간다는 것이 이 사람 티어리입니다. 그래서 파이겐바움이라는 사람이 이것도 프랙탈 모델을 계산을 했는데 이 프랙탈 모델에서 갈라지는 요 periodicity도 일정한 비율을 갖고 벌어진다고 얘기를 해요. 그래서 이 케이오스의 특징은 프리딕션은 어렵지만 마치 베이징에서 나비가 날아오를 때 얘네들이 앞으로 어떻게 될지 프리딕션은 어렵지만은 어떤 수학적인 공식을 갖고 이걸 계산할 수 있다는 게 디터미닝 할 수 있다는 게 케이오스의 핵심입니다. 그래서 프랙탈 모델에서 이 아까 로렌스 얘기했죠? 로렌스 업트랙터로 넘어가는 그런 과정을 보면은 이 프랙탈 모델이 처음에는 이니셜 컨디션 센시티비티 다시 말해서 우리가 이 일기예보를 1, 2주까지 어느 정도까지 예측이 가능하다고 그래요. 한국은 굉장히 근데 이게 예측이 어렵다고 그럽니다. 바다가 3면으로 둘러싸여 있어갖고. 그러나 아무리 스테이블한 뭐 예를 들어가지고 한국에서 태풍이 온다. 그럼 이게 호남으로 가냐 영남으로 가냐서 완전히 지금 갈리잖아요. 큰 뉴스가 되잖아. 근데 미국에서는 뭐 플로리다 지역이다 그러면 워낙 플로리다가 넓으니까 어디로 가도 플로리다로 가는 거예요. 그래서 한국 기후가 제일 예측하기 힘든데 이 로렌스 어트랙터가 사실 기상학자입니다. 그래서 이 사람이 예측을 해보니까 아주 초기 값의 미세한 차이만 가지고도 프리딕션이 굉장히 어려워지기 때문에 이걸 케오스 모델로 설명을 했어요. 그래서 처음에 Initial Condition Sensitivity 아주 미묘한 차이로도 그 결과값이 달라지기 때문에 이게 unpredictability가 특징이고, 그다음에 아까 얘기했던 quasi-periodicity가 aperiodicity로 바뀌는 거고, 그다음에 deterministic system. 그럼에도 불구하고 mathematically calculation 가능하다고 이렇게 설명을 하고 있죠. 그래서 요거를 잠깐 보여드리면은 예. 이게 그 지금 이제 로렌츠 어트랙트잖아요. 안 보여? 어떻게 돼? 이걸 또 해야 돼? 아, 로렌츠 나비잖아요. 이게 두 개로 지금 갈라진 거면 두 개만 계속 트레이싱 하는데 점점 달라지죠. 그래서 완전히 벌어져 가지고 다른 길을 가게 되는데 절대로 같은 포인트에 같이 겹치지 않는다. 그게 이 사람이 수학적으로 계산해서 증명한 로렌츠 어트랙트라는 모델이 되겠습니다. 그래서 다시 들어온 건가? 오케이. 그래서 왜 케오스냐? fibrillation은 노이즈가 아니다. deterministic, mathematical analysis deterministic 하지만은 unpredictable하다는 것이 로렌츠 리트랙터의 특징이고요. 이분이 그 케오스를 주창하십니다. 자, 이제 본론으로 가서 fibrillation을 한번 메커니즘 생각해 봅시다. fibrillation에는 traditionally there's two types of fibrillation. Number one is multiple wavelet theory. Number two, focal source theory. Multiple wavelet theory is 그 파도들이 sea, oceans, the wavelet collide and break up. Continuous collide and break up generates the fibrillation. That is multiple wavelet theory. Focal source theory is like a tornado. There's some source of fibrillation, but the fibrillate conduction. During conduction, there is a conduction block and wave break generated from this focal source. 그래서 multiple wavelet에는 우리가 EP 하면서 항상 공부하는 wavelength, refractory period multiplied by conduction velocity. Number two, critical mass. 그다음에 number three, restitution. Restitution is dynamic heterogeneity of repolarization and depolarization. For focal source theory, the Halife suggested the moderator hypothesis, and there's two tools to estimate the focal source, quantify the focal source theory. Is number one is dominant frequency analysis. Number two, phase singularity analysis. We use these two different mathematical analyses in the fibrillation analysis. As you know that there are three different mechanisms of arrhythmia: triggered activity, enhanced automaticity, and reentry. I would like to focus on the reentry mechanism today. So this is optical mapping model. Okay, red color means depolarization, and we gave pretty much a bit here and generated the reentry, beautiful reentry, and it start to break up like a fibrillation. So to generate the reentry, you need to remember this formula. Reentry susceptibility is the critical mass하고 비례하고 refractory period 곱하기 conduction velocity, wavelength에 반비례한다는 걸 기억해 두시면은 여러분들이 임상 매핑이나 어블레이션 하면서도 많이 도움을 받으실 거고요. Traditionally, there's many suggested mechanisms of fibrillation. So single loop, leading circle, spiral wave, three-dimensional scroll waves. And if the wave is going here, but the conduction velocity different depending on tissue condition and electrophysiological condition. If this area is a slow conduction, it's the wavelet rotate, generate this kind of spiral wave. That's one of the mechanisms of fibrillation. This is optical mapping study. This is the organized atrial fibrillation. you see this kind of quadruple reentry here, and this is anterior line. During anterior line ablation, with this organized atrial fibrillation terminated from here. Okay, so still in the clinical field, organized atrial fibrillation with quasi-periodicity, some point you see the spiral wave core. If target that area, you can terminate the fibrillation. Okay, let's start from multiple wavelet theory. I already explained this spiral wave breakup. You can see this kind of chaos during ventricular fibrillation or atrial fibrillation. 1964년도, already long time ago, Gordon Moore suggested and explained the electrophysiological mechanism. All we know now, he mentioned, described in his paper based on the computational modeling, and he emphasized mass of tissue, critical mass, refractory period, conduction velocity. Three components is very important to maintaining atrial fibrillation. It is based on the multiple wavelength hypothesis. 그래서 알레시가 이 고든 모어의 그 컨셉을 이제 애니멀 익스페리먼트에 적용을 한 거죠. 그래서 적어도 K9 모델에서 한 개의 체인버에 4 to 6 웨이브렛이 계속해서 continuous wave break을 일으켜야지만 atrial fibrillation 유지가 된다고 리포트를 했고, Jimmy Cox, he's a famous surgeon, applied this multiple wavelength hypothesis to human. It is the Maze operation, cadence operation, and because he reduced the critical mass significantly, so 이 웨이블렛이 4개 내지 6개가 머무를 수 있는 체인버를 컨테이너로 잘라버린 거죠. 그러니까 AF가 메인테인이 안 되더라. 그래서 우리가 이렇게 멀티플 리니어 어블레이션 하는 거 이유도 그런 하이퍼시스를 가지고 하는데, 제가 한 15년 동안 이걸 해보니까 이게 꼭 맞는 건 아닌 것 같습니다. 그 다음에 이제 아까 얘기했었던 wavelength와 critical mass의 관계. wavelength는 refractory period multiplied by conduction velocity, and the critical mass is to maintain fibrillation, certain amount of myocardial mass is mandatory. This is Dr. Young Kim's paper, old paper. He cut up the swine right ventricle continuously. Initially, it was ventricular fibrillation, but organized, and eventually changed to ventricular tachycardia because there's no room for wave break. And there's a report for the fibrillation number, same formula. If you decrease the critical mass, increase the refractory period, or increase the conduction velocity, fibrillation maintenance duration is shorter. 그래서 이건 이런 좋은 correlation 보이는 걸 확인할 수가 있었고요. Stanley Natel is suggested a very important theory for the atrial fibrillation remodeling, and in his principle, the atrial fibrillation begets atrial fibrillation because action potential duration shortened by electrical remodeling, and the conduction velocity slowed down because the electrical remodeling and gap junctional remodeling and fibrosis, and the increase the left atrial size, increase the container for the continuous wave break, maintains the patient heart condition more susceptible to maintaining fibrillation. Okay, that's the remodeling mechanism. Okay, lastly, and based on the multiple wavelength hypothesis, you need to understand the concept of restitution. Restitution is dynamic heterogeneous action potential duration. So x-axis in this graph is diastole interval, y-axis is action potential duration. You all know as a fast heart rate, action potential duration is shorter. but the shortening of action potential duration degree is different depending on cellular condition. So if you pace faster, you can draw this kind of curve, and based on the restitution concept, maximum slope of this restitution curve is very important for susceptibility to continuous wave break. Because it depends on the heart rate and diastole interval, we call it restitution dynamic heterogeneity interval, APD. Okay, let's look at this example. At this point of relatively easy slope of restitution, ectopy converges to the original restitution curve. But at the steep portion of restitution, it cannot come back and going to the chaos. Okay, so that's why the maximum slope of restitution is very important. And this slope is depending on the single cell, based on the single cell study, single cell restitution. But with the development of technology, we can measure the tissue level of restitution and organ level of restitution. Okay, let's switch gear to focal source theory. So far, I explained about the multiple wavelength theory and focal source theory. You can imagine the tornado. So it is already a long time ago. It is also modeling studies and optical mapping studies. There's some source of fibrillation. This is ventricular fibrillation study. And in this point, the fast Fourier transformation shows the peak dominant frequency. This is so-called dominant frequency the concept, and Gray and Khalifa suggested this the mother rotor on focal source theory. Okay, why then the focal source generated fibrillation? Because 이게 이제 포토스코프로 이건 뭐라 그러죠? 저기 이름 생각이 안 나. 컨덕션이 이렇게 가는데 black color is depolarization, white color is repolarization. Depending on tissue condition and electrophysiological condition, there's conduction difference, and during conduction, it changes the conduction block, and stationary conduction make a localized reentry. So we saw the scroll wave in three-dimensional structure like this. So focal source exists, and the fibrillated conduction continues the conduction block and colliding generated fibrillation. That is the focal source hypothesis. And as I told you, the dominant frequency can stand for the location of this focal source. This is the Waldo's paper in atrial fibrillation large animal model. Is some focal source maintaining the atrial fibrillation. Phase singularity is a similar concept, but totally different mathematical analysis. If you plotting this the fibrillation wavelets amplitude in x-axis and plus t sometime later on the y-axis, you can see there this kind of pattern, okay, cyclic pattern. But in this point, there's some scroll wave or spiral wave core. This point merge to this center. There is no cycling pattern, so-called phase singularity. Singularity means the ambiguous point. So even though there's an angle and phase, but if there is no phase, that point is singular point, and most of these phase singular points match to the spiral wave core. Okay, so you already saw this figure in the human heart atrial fibrillation model. But when I was in the United States in 2000, there's a big arguments between multiple wavelength hypothesis and focal source hypothesis. But eventually the scientists 타협을 했죠. 그래서 여기 보면은 tissue excitability에 따라서 이런 multiple wavelet fibrillation하고 focal source fibrillation이 한 동물이나 한 환자에서도 같이 존재할 수 있다는 게 보고되었고, 여기에는 이제 tissue excitability가 굉장히 중요하다는 것을 알게 됐습니다. TJU가 처음으로 리포트를 했었고요. 그래서 아까 그 주무시다 돌아가신 VF EKG를 보면은 처음에는 굉장히 fast disorganized ventricular fibrillation with the cardiac arrest and global ischemia, tissue excitability reduced and changed slow BF and eventually the PA arrest. Okay. atrial fibrillation에서도 이게 ECG-I 가지고 한 스터디인데 보면은 푸클리츠가 요새 그 SBRT 하신 분이잖아요. 옛날에 로 루디오 같이 일했었더라고요. 이런 멀티플 웨이블릿이 한 90% 되고 포컬 소스 액티비티가 15% 정도 된다고 이 스터디에서 보고를 했는데, 이것도 역시 티슈 컨디션에 따라서 이런 로트 액티비티가 더 증가할 수 있는 것 같습니다. 자, 그럼 엔티어리스믹 드럭하고 타겟을 잠깐 설명을 드리면은, 우리가 뭐 클래스 1, 클래스 3 엔티어리스믹 드럭에서는 잘 알고 계시고요. 액션 포텐셜 커브를 볼 때 디폴라리제이션은 인월드 소디움 커런트로 구성이 되었고, 리폴라리제이션은 아웃월드 포태슘 커런트로 구성이 되어 있는데, 클래스 1 엔티어리스믹 드럭은 주로 소디움 채널 블로커죠. 클래스 3는 포태슘 채널 블로커고. 그럼 어떻게 해서 이 약제가 됐는가 한번 봅시다. 여기 이제 모델을 가지고 보면은 리엔트리가 돌다가 여기 보면은 빨간 부분이 excitable gap. If there is excitable gap, it continues the reentry, right? So, but if we increase the refractory period, this is still refractory period, and the reentrant wavelet collide to the refractory period and terminate. That's the mechanism of class 3 enterostomy drug. Okay, or we can increase conduction velocity. It's fast. Also, wavefront collide to the refractory period of the previous bit and terminated the fibrillation. But so far, there is no drug to increase conduction velocity. There was a rot gap tide which increased gap junction enhancer, but it was not approved from FDA, so we cannot use that drug to human. Then, class 1 enterostomic drug, sodium channel blocker, reduced conduction velocity, right? Then it's opposite direction to wavelengths. But how the class 1 enterostomic drug terminated the fibrillation? Because slow conduction velocity enlarge the spiral wave core and make a collide to the anatomical boundary. That's the mechanism of a class 3 enterostomic drug to stop the reentry. In other words, sodium channel blocker can work to the small size chamber heart, but if it's a large heart, the severely remodeling heart, sodium channel blocker cannot terminate the fibrillation. But it depends on the condition, but theoretically it is. And what we are doing during ablation, there's spiral wave core, we give some more lesion and terminate. Actually, our daily business is destructive surgery, not a regenerative surgery. Okay, so what is the mechanism of atrial fibrillation? Long time ago, we studied atrial critical mass, measuring the atrial defibrillation threshold, and when I add one line, more and more line, the defibrillation threshold, which reflects the critical mass, reduce. So atrium also has a critical mass, but just by large antral pulmonary vein isolation, reduce the critical mass 17 to 25%. So most of patients, large antral PV isolation is good enough to reduce atrial critical mass. So from my understanding so far. And this patient is a valvular atrial fibrillation, history of mitral valvuloplasty. In those patients, sometimes we cannot see atrial fibrillation, only atrial tachycardia or very organized atrial fibrillation. Why? Even though the chamber size is very big, but the myocardial mass is very small. So there's no room to maintain the fibrillation, no chaos, because myocardial mass is very small. So in those patients, generally shows atrial tachycardia or very organized fibrillation. Okay, let's see. Dr. Kim Tae-ri, what do you see? This is atrial rhythm. This is pulmonary vein map. This is atrium. This is PB. What happened? Dr. Georgia?
One or atrial beats one
Hmm?
or atrial beat PV potential and one ventricular.
Yes. So atrium is in sinus rhythm, right? Pulmonary vein inside, fibrillation wave. But the pulmonary vein has very small critical mass, right? But still there is fibrillation. It is not tachycardia. If it is a organized reentry, we can call it the PV tachycardia. What is fibrillation? So this advocate the focal source theory, not the multiple wavelet, because to maintain the multiple wavelet hypothesis-based fibrillation, we need certain amount of mass, but we already PV isolation, and inside PV there's fibrillation. Okay, it is there suggests a focal in some condition focal source hypothesis, right?
If you look at that tracing,
Hmm?
this is a more like a reentry, not a true fibrillation. Okay, because you look at the EGM, they're pretty much the similar pattern, and activation sequences are similar. When you have a quadriperiodicity, you need to change all that. And then for people to look at the tracing, I have one recommendation. Always read the surface issue first. What surface issue shows you? Sinus rhythm.
Sinus rhythm.
Okay. So don't panic. Just look at the sinus rhythm first, then come down. Okay. Again, we try to ask you to develop your own way to look at the tracing systematically so you don't miss the things. Okay. It's practice. It's good.
Dr. Huang favors multiple wavelengths.
No, I don't believe none of
But
those.
another Dr. Huang favors the focal source.
Wow.
I'll show you the data.
Yeah, atrial fibrillation,
Yeah.
ventricular fibrillation always starts from the focus.
As you know,
We'll talk about that later. But,
yeah, we are doing the computation modeling study for a long time, and Dr. Taeyeon Huang recently submitted new ideas. And okay, so during mapping, during PB isolation, we send this mapping data to core lab and analyze their computer fibrillation, atrial fibrillation, and analyze dominant frequency phase singularity. And this is the stable phase singularity. Phase singularity localized in 1 centimeter diameter, lasting longer than 2 seconds. So we exclude all the meandering phase singularity points, and during ovulating this point, atrial fibrillation culminated. Okay. Of course, we isolate the PB antral ablation first. Then we try to ablate the remaining. And Dr. Taeyeon Huang compared the stable phase singular point and the dominant frequency side. And this is a stable PS map and the low voltage area and the restitution map and dominant frequency map. The problem of focal source theory is the dominant frequency side always meandering. It's go around. So how to make a proper target? So he analyzed the 3 different periods and only selected the stable dominant frequency side and try to match with phase singlet point. This is clinical outcome. The patient with stable phase singlet point, in other words, after PB isolation, if there is another focal source, those patients show the worst rhythm outcome. And the stable phase singlet point with temporarily stable dominant frequency, even worse rhythm outcome after PB isolation. Why? After PB isolation, there is the remaining focal source. Okay. So lastly, I would like to mention about the ventricular fibrillation quickly. And this Hasagear is a Purkinje potential guided VF ablation paper. I'm not sure it is PBC ablation or the real focal source ablation, but anyway, they insisted it works. And it's a long time ago. The papillary muscle is very important to maintaining the ventricular fibrillation. This is mapping study, and there is a reentrant wavelets around the papillary muscle. And papillary muscle structure is lose the myocardial connection with the ventricular free wall, and there is always the loose electrical coupling of a Purkinje system. So I try to ablate the papillary muscle by RF and compare with the epicardial ablation, whole endocardial ablation, and papillary muscle ablation works in the animal model, rabbit model. So after coming back from United States, I tried to this hypothesis in large animal, the swine model. It is epicardial mapping, and we also do the non-contact endocardial mapping. And after induced ventricular fibrillation, global ischemia changed to type 2 VF. And at the type 2 VF with global ischemia, there's a reentrant wavelet around the papillary muscle. So we did ventricular maze in swine heart. After ventricular maze, it shows the enterostomy effect. Interesting. Of course, it is not applied to the human, but theoretically it works. In swine, in dog, this ventricular maze has an enterostomy effect, but swine, no. We suspect the reason why swine has a subepicardial Purkinje system, unlikely to human. So even though we ablated the endocardial ablation, subepicardial, the Purkinje system can induce another fibrillation. I was so glad to apply this ventricular maze last Friday with Dr. Wang. This is our review. Papillary muscle is here, and this patient with heart failure was very difficult to ablate, but we ablate from papillary muscle. It was the Dr. Huang's suggestion to the mitral annulus, and finally we succeeded in the case. I don't know, we need to wait more, but it was my first experience to apply the ventricular maze in human. Don't burn too much, please. Animal and human is totally different. Okay, so last topic is artificial intelligence can determine fibrillation target. We discuss about the cosmos, quasi-periodicity, chaos to random, but AI, I asked the ChatGPT, we can analyze the fibrillation target by AI. Of course, the ChatGPT answer was, it's possible, but there's some limitation. He mentioned about limitation. As we discussed in the Lorentz attractor, initial condition, even though it is predictable, even though it is determined by mathematical analysis, but the long-term outcome, it is hard to predict based on chaos theory. So fractal model, Lorentz attractor, fibrillation, human ventricular maze, it all works. However, still we don't know. We can predict this long-term outcome of fibrillation. So last word is yesterday's history. Tomorrow is a mystery. Today is a gift. because we call it present. Today is present. Okay, thank you. Question? 우리 이제 볼까요?
선생님께서는 AP은 랜덤이 아니고 케이오스다라고 말씀.
아까 내가 슬라이드 하나 보여주려고 말았는데 그게 이제 그 우리가 일렉트론을 처음 볼 때 내가 그 프로시저 하면서 이제 펠로우 선생님들한테 물어볼 거예요. 근데 일렉트론을 보면서 이게 케이오스에 가까운지 아니면은 멀티플 웨이브에 가까운지 포컬 소스에 가까운지 그걸 상상하면서 하는 게 굉장히 중요하다고 생각하고요. 피브레이션 그 자체는 케이오스죠. 그렇지만은 이게 오버나이즈 되면서 피리어디스티가 많아질수록 이런 에이트럴 피브레이션은 maybe 우리가 PB 아이솔레이션 하고 나서 그 타겟 찾기가 조금 더 쉬워진다고 그렇게만 믿고 있습니다. 현 선생님은 어떻게 생각하십니까?
I think atrial fibrillation is a continual, ongoing dynamic change of rhythm. So even chaos, he explained there's a certain quadriperiodicity of organization and breakup. Now, we are looking at the heart, a very simplistic model, because we treat the atrial fibrillation as a 2D modeling. Because simply based on the endocardial mapping, you're trying to understand entire process of fibrillation. I think that's a mistake. So we still have to interpret all this data with quite our limitation. Okay. I never thought that atrial fibrillation was two-dimensional, and it's even in chaos. Chaos is actually, if you look at the quadriperiodicity, everything else has to be three-dimensional. In two-dimensional, you can explain. So the reason is that he showed some example of a three-dimensional model. You keep cutting critical mass and so on to making that two-dimensional, then easier to terminate. That's what he did. So I think if you look at, for example, focal atrial fibrillation trigger, because at the pulmonary vein is going to start with a singularity point of a trigger, which that PAC sometimes can go progress into the chaotic model, may not. That depends on conduction velocity, so on, refractoriness in the environment. So if you map carefully with the high resolution mapping PB trigger, once it start, they have to trigger tachycardia, and that tachycardia have to accelerate. Our PP interval get a bit shorter progress. And then usually first 3-4 bit of initiation of any mechanism of fibrillation is a figure 8 reentry. We have a human PF mapping study, that's why we know that. So if you terminate, deliver energy, whatever, to interrupt that figure 8, you won't go to the atrial fibrillation. That's why latest modeling, for example, since we cannot understand whole perspective, three-dimensional of this quadriperiodic fibrillation, for example, Washington University Igor Efimov, he tried to detect the PVC that which it can potentially go into the VF. It can deliver low energy electric impulse or either pacing therapy to block the figure 8, not to develop. That is a concept of a low threshold defibrillation mechanism. That's what they're studying. The same as he showed the PV isolation, which is associated with the rest of the atrium. But if you look at that model carefully, they are not a true fibrillation. They are more like a multiple reentry. That's why EATH is much more organized. That's what I pointed out. So I believe quadriperiodicity has us with a singular point of a trigger mechanism. That variation has to include temporal variation, acceleration, and conduction velocity, and so forth, that amplify proportionally. But more importantly, I think substrate, the geometry is important. Why pulmonary vein trigger more fibrillation other non-PB focused atrial fibrillation? You think about that. It's simply because the electric physiologic property? I doubt it. Why? Look at the PV, how they're shaped. Looks like a nothing. Looks like a horn. So as you accelerate the diameter with conduction, get amplified faster. But as you from single layer of a muscle, as you come up by the os, you become already 4 different layers of muscle. So we even to look at the EGM as a single EGM point is far more complex than that. So I believe it has to be also substrate characteristic, tissue thickness, tissue mass. So when we say that arrhythmogenic tissue mass, based on the, for example, endocardial voltage, That's a far way wrong, untruthful representation. But unfortunately, that's what we got so far. So once we have a true 3D histology, morphology, layer muscle activation, propagation, electrophysical property, we want to understand. That's why he's, all this Van der Holt and all these people fractal model. And I actually showed a beautiful picture. I spent actually almost all day in that church because 1990, even Van der Holt developed a theory of a fractal, 1965 in Paris. This Gaudi, late 19th century guy. So how did he, design all this? I tried to understand, and it was a quite remarkable revelation for me. And then especially he's the designer of trees simulating all that. So I think there is some aspect that we still don't understand. And that's why I think base science is so important. So don't think what we know today is a true reflection of that. It's time as a universe. We keep expanding, we keep learning more, and then you can see some system colliding, fusing. I'm sure that happened in our heart as well. So today, this morning, we are sitting talking, Dr. Park and I think life itself, entire universe, whether bacteria, whether human being, whatever, I think is all started as chaos, organized and the product. So it is a bottom line, competitive evolution. I don't know how many of you guys been on this HRS meeting, basic science meeting. Edward Nakata gave a lecture of sinus rhythm genesis. And he, clear to me, he shows a sinus rhythm genesis of chaos star, sparkling calcium spark in the myocardial and then syncytial and sinus nodal cell environment. So I don't believe there is a single tissue. There's an environment has to be formed to develop chaos. That pre-requirement is essentially important. And that's why a lot of people talk about Big Bang. But before Big Bang has to have this environmentally Big Bang energy could progress into chaos and progress into the universe. I think it also, we need to understand that first. And I think atrial fibrillation, BF is the same. That's the way I see things.
As far as I understand, the atrial fibrillation is a spectrum. Yeah, the single
Yes.
disease, and from the atrial tachycardia to real chaos, and some patients even after multiple linear ablation still maintaining the atrial
Yeah.
fibrillation, not atrial tachycardia. So it is not that simple. So nowadays the pulse-field ablation PB isolation is very popular. There's two different sides. One thing is we cannot understand the atrial fibrillation mechanism at all by just PB isolation. But the other one is we can PB enteroablation faster. Then please send me the recurrent patient.
Wow.
I will map the EPN
Yeah.
and then we'll say to you.
If you see a patient with a multiple fibrillation, you go in invariably, there are going to be more than one substrate potentially create atrial fibrillation. Either PB is not completely isolated, plus the linearity has a gap. Now, if you have a true nice PB isolation and then you create some linear lesions, they will likely come back with atrial flutter, not the fibrillation. But the other hand, if a patient has a atrial flutter plus focal trigger left, they're going to come back with the fibrillation. So then people ask me when I go to attend my junior's multiple ablation patient. So I ask him, what are you going to do? Then you have to think, if that's a possibility, what? We need to eliminate the trigger because you did not look for. So look at the trigger and then check the previous ablation lines. Often that resolves 90% cases. From patient standpoint, it does not make a difference whether it's a flutter or fibrillation. You symptom the same. That's why I think we have this huge changes. But I always tell my fellows, look for patient. Don't look at the rhythm. You need to know fundamental basic what is happening with the patient. So EP is the same way. I still firmly believe you should not ablate whatever, no matter what tachycardia might be, without EP study. That's the bottom line. And I firmly believe that's a truly beneficial to the patient. That's why I'm against the PFA prior doing cases without EP, not technology per se. You can do or deliver what you think is right. However, we want you to get the basic concept of electrophysiologic property with that particular patient's heart, which is a different everybody. So without that, you cannot make a right decision. I firmly believe that. So we're going to the same path again. Prior without EP study, PFA without EP study. This is going to be a problem. And then a lot of more concern to me PFA because PFA creating more massive larger lesion. Let's say that your diagnosis is correct, you're going to more likely get rid of it. Okay, trade-off was okay because a larger lesion. But then let's say that the non-PV trigger is the source of a fibrillation. You can isolate a PV much as you want to. Patient still come back to you the same way. Now you got worse because you lost maybe 30–40% HR mass of that patient. So we need to think about this long term. I mean, for us, we live in this life, we practice medicine for 15–20 years probably. But the younger patient going to carry on, live it on with that scar. So what might be happening? Those things is important to think through. Because you want to do much as a benefit of patient for your patient, not for that fibrillation business. So that's why I really think important fellows to start thinking. Okay. Very good.
Any other question?
Yes,
Okay,
please.
please.
This week and last week during the AFib ablation, it was the first time seeing the CAFE, the complex fractionated atrial electrogram. Then for the cases that you have performed CAFE, does that mean that is more multiple wavelength there, or is it focal? I'm not so sure what you were trying to see there.
Still, even though there is a cafe proposed by Dr. Nademani long time ago, but still we don't know the exact mechanics of cafe. But it includes some the rotor, as I show in the modeling study. Actually, I have some frustrating cases. The patient was 50 years plus, and the brother was my collaborator engineer. And I did 3 times ablation, including multiple linear ablation. Still fibrillation, not atrial tachycardia. If it is really multiple wavelet theory, because as you know, that I give the lot of energy and try my best for transmural lesion, but still fibrillation. So that patient, I did the right side and left side a cafe. So far, no more atrial fibrillation for 2 years. So some subset of patients, this kind of a focal source contributes to atrial fibrillation recurrence mechanism. So that's why I'm very happy to see the Dr. Tian Huang's study, because that's not my fault. I did not I should have meant more, but as far as I know, we still many things unknown field we need to understand. As Dr. Huang told, atrial fibrillation also has a 3-dimensional structure. Some areas are very thick, and there's no gold standard how much ablate we can make the epicardial, the trigger epicardial drive ablation. So hopefully we need epicardial.
It's think as a a rhythmic environment. Don't think as a one focal mechanism. This sometimes until you eliminate other coexisting arrhythmia mechanism, changing environment, natural environment exists to the more simplistic environment, then you'll be able to see more evident. Unfortunately, you wonder after you've done linear lesion and all that, and here's a case example, cafe persist or whatever local mechanism. If you could have seen that first time without doing PVI linear lesion, easy fibrillation would respond the same way. You don't know even that. Okay. Question is very valid, very important one. However, answer, I think, far beyond our limitation at this point. So that's why we need the basic research. Younger people need to study and then give us idea. We just, unfortunately, living still many years of atrial fibrillation project. Myself, with thousands cases. We still don't have a clear-cut answer for younger generation to tell them, look, this is what you should do. I think that's not right. We don't know, bottom line. Then let's look at again, let's approach it different way. And I wish that industry, many other people, all those over the last 20 years, invest billions of dollars, at least some of that went to the basic research. We would be much better off than now. Unfortunately, they didn't. So in this era now, unfortunately, very discouraging because scientific grants, basic labs are very struggling for funding. I'm sure same in Korea, United States, and Europe as well. So you can see quality of basic research paper coming up, not as good as used. So funding is very, very important. So that's important for you guys, organize, reflect what you need to the country. As a scientist, there's many other things that I think carry on with true meaningful study, the country.
One more thing, cafe is not my routine practice.
Well,
Okay, it's only exceptional case. Even after this atrial fibrillation, not tachycardia continues after multiple linear ablation, then I try.
okay. First of all, CAFE definition, extremely variable. You ask another money, one thing. You ask Yong Kim, another thing. You ask somebody else, different thing. They're not talking the same language, first place. So is there any strict criteria? What do you call CAFE? You talk another money? He has no idea. He simply based on the one functional physiologic study, wave collision, and then break up. And then based on he refer, he start burning the patient. He and I, we practice the same time, unfortunately, many years. When he finishes procedure, all patients end up with atrial flutter. Not one. One time I ablate all day because he created 6 different flutter. Okay, I'm terminate one, and then another inducible I'm going after. And that was very painful experience. So that particular area we practiced, we told him, don't go to that guy. This doesn't work. And he always presented his talk, always one case, 82-year-old guy. I still remember his case very well. In the older man, 10-year atrial fibrillation. He burned and terminated, he's still being sinus rhythm. You can believe on that kind of story, okay? So I think he needs to show progress to develop his technical CAFE. Yes, we do believe it. He doesn't have no other data other than statistical analysis. So I think bottom line, don't do things that you don't know. Don't harm the patient, okay? Maybe tomorrow someone smarter will come out with a better answer. That is what I think we should be doing.
Okay.
All right, guys.
Already 9:25. Thank you
Thank you very much.
everybody.